She listened to the last whispers of those about to die, and recorded everything. But what she discovered on one of those tapes was so disturbing that she had to disappear. No one knew. No doctor suspected. But behind the white coat and gentle smile, there was a nurse who hid an absurdly dark secret. She secretly recorded the confessions of her terminal patients. And among those recordings, there was something that wasn't human. For more than a decade, Margaret Allen, a fictitious name given by authorities, worked at an isolated hospital in the Scottish Highlands. She was known for compassionately caring for patients in their final days of life. But what no one knew is that she encouraged them to tell their biggest secrets moments before departing. She would say, "You can trust me. This goes with you." What the patients didn't know was that she was recording everything. The first tapes were touching, stories of lost love, regrets, late forgiveness. But over time, disturbing confessions began to emerge. Accounts of unpunished murders, secret cults, dark pacts made during wars. And then came tape 58. She listened to it alone in the break room. When it ended, she didn't sleep for 3 days. The following week, she resigned and disappeared. For years, her story was considered just a bizarre rumor among former colleagues. But in 2023, something unexpected happened. An abandoned house was demolished in the interior of Aberdeen, and a diary was found. It belonged to the nurse. In it, the dates of each recording were noted, and a single name underlined in red ink. Jeremy Ainsworth. A name that should never have been there. A name linked to a famous disappearance from 1974. What was on tape 58? Why was this name in her diary? And what else did she discover before disappearing? Today you're going to hear the story no one had the courage to tell. The hospital where death whispered secrets. In the 1970s, hidden among the misty hills of Scotland, there existed a hospital with a peculiar reputation. St. Elwick's Hospice, founded post-war, was an isolated place, almost forgotten by time. There was no signage, it didn't appear on tourist maps and was only known by the oldest residents of the nearby village of Durness. A place built for those who had no more hope, the end of the line for many. Surrounded by barren fields and dense forests, the building had small windows, narrow corridors and a constant smell of disinfectant mixed with mold. It was very windy there. At night, the sounds of wind passing through the cracks in the windows seemed like laments from another world. It was there that Margaret Allen began working in 1969. No one knew much about her. She came from Glasgow, said little about her personal life and seemed to keep her distance from other staff. But patients loved her presence. They said Margaret knew how to listen, and that her calm voice brought comfort in final moments. The hospital, on the other hand, lived on the brink of decay. The war had left physical and psychological scars on patients. Many were veterans, others victims of traumas that medicine of the time didn't know how to treat. And there was a disturbing detail. St. Elwick's was one of the few hospitals that accepted patients with advanced mental disorders and terminal illnesses simultaneously. It was as if time stopped there. The radio in the break room still played music from the 50s. Doctors followed old protocols, and some patients were treated with methods that would be considered archaic today, including electroshock sessions and prolonged isolation. In old archives, there are mentions of phenomena that the administration preferred not to comment on. Patients who spoke languages they didn't know. Collective outbursts during dawn. And a case in 1973, where all the hospital clocks stopped at the same minute, 3:17 a.m. That night, a patient died suffocated. But his body was found with a smile on his face. It was in this environment that Margaret began listening and later recording. She said that many patients in their final hours seemed to enter a trance. They spoke of things they had never told anyone, and their voices changed. Deeper, slower, more intense. According to later reports, it was after one of these episodes that Margaret began noting everything in her red notebook. A diary that would only come to light almost 50 years later, in a forgotten mansion, sealed from inside with boards and symbols drawn with white chalk on the walls. But the strangest thing is that no one remembers exactly when Margaret left the hospital. Neither colleagues nor medical records. She simply vanished. The sound that should never have been heard. It was a rainy October night in 1974 when it all began. The hospital lights flickered from time to time, as if something there was interfering with the electrical grid. Margaret Allen, as usual, was doing her shift in the South Block, the wing where the most debilitated patients stayed. Those who no longer spoke, didn't eat alone, and who, according to doctors, had only days to live. The patient this time was William McCrae, a former philosophy professor who had been hospitalized after being diagnosed with terminal cancer. He had lost his speech in recent weeks, communicating only with his gaze and minimal gestures. Margaret liked him. He was a quiet man, but his eyes, deep and restless, seemed to carry the weight of many unspoken truths. That dawn, something unusual happened. Margaret was sitting beside his bed, holding his hand, when William suddenly opened his eyes forcefully. He looked directly at her and began to murmur disconnected phrases. But what caught her attention was the tone of voice. It wasn't William's voice. It was hoarse, deeper, almost guttural. He said names, places, dates. He spoke about a fire that destroyed a school, about a child locked in a basement, about doctors who closed their eyes, and an agreement made in 1952 that could never be broken. Margaret, frightened, grabbed a small portable recorder, something she used to record medical notes. She placed it on the sheet and pressed the red button. She recorded everything. At the end of the account, William fell into a deep sleep. The next day he was dead. Margaret took the tape home. She didn't tell anyone. That night, she listened to the audio repeatedly. At first, she thought it was just delirium. But then she noticed something strange. In certain parts of the recording, background sounds could be heard, like footsteps, whispers, and muffled laughter. She re-recorded the audio on a new tape, marked it with a red sticker, wrote, "McCrae 11:17 p.m., confession?" and stored it in a shoebox along with a note. If I disappear, this was the first one. From that day on, everything changed. Margaret began carrying the recorder on all shifts. Discreetly, she would place it under patients' pillows or between folded sheets. As death approached, voices emerged, and the accounts became more strange. Some spoke of never-solved crimes. Others of pacts made in ancient rituals. There was a patient who confessed to hiding bodies inside his own house for more than 20 years, and no one ever investigated him. Another said he wasn't from there, that he came from another time, and that he had returned to settle scores. They all had a macabre detail in common. They mentioned a name that Margaret could never decipher. A whispered name, like an echo repeated among the voices. He comes. He knows. He sees. She noted everything. Organized the tapes in chronological order. Created patterns, compared dates, and began to perceive connections between patients who had never met. And then one day she recorded something that shouldn't have existed. The patient who didn't exist in the records. It was February 1978 when Margaret received a patient who wasn't listed on any hospital spreadsheet. His name was Joseph Langdon, and he had supposedly been transferred from a psychiatric institution closed decades ago, the Greystone Sanatorium, demolished in 1959. And yet, there he was, with a handwritten medical record, outdated and with bizarre gaps in the medical history. Langdon's eyes were completely black, like bottomless wells. He didn't blink, didn't react to stimuli. But his presence, according to Margaret's description in her notebooks, was suffocating. Nurses avoided entering the room. One of the doctors, when performing a routine examination, reported hearing a voice inside her head saying, "Don't awaken what was sealed." On the second night, Margaret positioned the recorder near the headboard. There was a strange energy in the air. The entire hospital seemed quieter, as if the structure itself was in a state of waiting. At 3:16 a.m., Langdon sat up in bed, alone. Without assistance, he looked at the recorder, smiled, and began to speak. You think you're collecting confessions, but you're feeding an ancient whisper. Each recorded voice, each revealed secret, is an invitation. Margaret was paralyzed. She didn't understand how he knew about the recorder, how he knew everything, and worse, how he knew about the other tapes. You open the first door. Now you can't stop anymore. The seventh will be the last. When the last one speaks, the cycle closes, and you will see. The next day, Joseph Langdon disappeared. Literally. The bed was empty, sheets folded. No discharge record. No camera captured his exit. Doctors claimed he was never hospitalized there. Margaret confronted the administration. She brought the tape as proof. But when they pressed play, the content had changed. There was no more voice, only static. And in the background, a repetitive sound, like a broken clock, marking time that no longer existed. She tried to alert colleagues. No one believed. Some even mocked. Others called her unstable. It was at this point that Margaret understood. The recordings were connected to something that didn't want to be revealed. Something that reacted. Something that watched. That night, she wrote in her diary, "If this is the last tape, may at least someone know. The truth is in the voices, but they charge a price. One that maybe I'm already paying." And then came the consequences. What she awakened could never be silenced. After Joseph K. Langdon's disappearance, Margaret tried to distance herself. She requested a transfer to another hospital, stopped recording, threw away the notebooks, sealed the tapes and hid them in a metal box buried in her parents' basement. But some truths, once spoken, can no longer be unspoken. 2 weeks later, she began hearing voices. Not in the corridors, not in dreams, in her own breathing. She heard whispers when she exhaled. Voices that hid in the sound of wind entering through windows. Voices that imitated the timbre of patients she had recorded, but saying phrases that were never said. You thought it was just curiosity, didn't you? You recorded their souls, and now it's recorded in you. Doctors said it was stress, anxiety disorder, classic diagnosis, brief reactive psychosis. But she knew that wasn't something mental, it was something spiritual. One by one, the patients who had confessed before her recorder died under strange conditions. 2 of them were found with open eyes and burned lips, as if something had come out from within them. Another, who had revealed his wife's murder, disappeared on discharge day and was never found. In all cases, the tapes disappeared from the cabinet where they were stored. And then came the dreams. Margaret dreamed of a hospital that no longer existed. A dark hospital without windows where all doors were locked, except one. Behind that door there was an old red recorder with a tape that spun by itself. And from the recorder, a voice, deep, firm, masculine, said, "When the last confession is heard, the truth will be freed. You were the receptacle. But now you must choose, keep or liberate." Margaret began to suspect there was a pattern. Each confession seemed to be part of an unconscious ritual, as if she were reconstructing something with each recording. A spiritual puzzle, a shapeless entity that needed to be heard to exist. And then, she made the final mistake. She listened to all the tapes at once. She placed 7 recorders side by side, pressed play, and sat on the floor listening. On the first tape, a man cries. On the second, a woman confesses she killed her own children. On the third, someone whispers numbers in a dead language. On the fourth, there's silence, but breathing can be heard. On the fifth, a child says they see someone with white eyes in the mirror. On the sixth, the tape simply repeats the phrase, "Return to the place where it all began." And the 7th tape shouldn't exist. She didn't remember recording it, but there it was. When she pressed play, she heard her own voice, only it was a different version. Older, tired, with a tone of desperation. "If you've gotten this far, stop. Burn the tapes. Never tell anyone. Never tell anyone. If you hear this, it means I failed. He will return. He's already here. At that moment, the house's power went out. Neighbors said they heard a scream coming from inside. But when they arrived, Margaret was no longer there. The door was locked from the inside. Lights out. The recorder, running by itself. On the wall, written with something like charcoal. She freed the 8th. And since then, Margaret has never been seen again. The epilogue that never ends. Margaret Langdon's case was filed as voluntary disappearance. The hospital where she worked claimed she suffered from mental disorders, and any mention of the recordings was considered conspiratorial speculation. But something strange happened. 3 years later, a group of university students investigating urban legends found an unidentified tape at an antique fair in the state of Vermont. When they played it, the audio was unrecognizable. Overlapping voices, muffled screams, sounds in reverse. But among the noises, one phrase was clear, repeated 3 times. He needs more ears. The audio went viral. Some people reported nightmares after hearing it. Others claimed to see shadows in their room or hear knocking on the door between 3 and 4 a.m. A phonetic specialist compared the sound waves and concluded, it wasn't a human voice. Since then, similar reports have emerged on deep web forums. Anonymous users said they had found new tapes, each with a new confession. But the most disturbing thing was that all these confessions seemed to respond to each other, as if they were building a single fragmented story. A story that is still being told. And there's an even stranger detail. In the official archives of St. Catherine's Clinic, a recording was attached to Margaret Langdon's medical record. It's short, less than 30 seconds. No noise, no distortions. Just one clear phrase with a woman's voice, identical to Margaret's, saying, "If you're hearing this, he's already with you." And now, what would you do? Do you think Margaret was a victim of something psychological or spiritual? Did she just reveal too many truths? Or did she touch something that should never be recorded? How many confessions would be necessary to free what is trapped between worlds? And the most frightening, someone is continuing this work now. Because if she disappeared, who is recording the new tapes?